Few would have imagined that the soul of a deceased person might continue to remain nearby. Not as a ghost, not as a memory, but as a profound psychological reality. Yet this was exactly what Marie-Louise von Franz, one of Carl Jung's closest collaborators, firmly believed. For decades, she studied the behavior of the soul at the moment of death and beyond, and concluded, "Not everyone who leaves truly departs." In the dreams and inner lives of the living, she repeatedly discovered subtle signs, echoes, messages, a presence that felt unmistakably real. In this video, we'll explore what lies behind that lingering presence, why dreams of the dead should never be dismissed as mere fantasy, and how ancient archetypes help us understand that death is not an end, but a threshold. Marie-Louise von Franz was not just a follower of Carl Jung. She was one of the most trusted interpreters of his ideas, and the person who carried his legacy into new realms of psychological and spiritual insight. A Swiss psychologist and scholar of classical languages, she worked closely with Jung for over 30 years and became a key figure in the development of analytical psychology. Her approach was not mystical in the popular sense, but deeply rooted in symbolic logic, dream interpretation, and the archetypal language of the unconscious. Among her most influential works is the book on dreams and death, where she explored the hidden connection between the symbolic world of dreams and the soul's journey through death. In this book, von Franz proposed something radical for her time, that the transition from life to death is not always instantaneous. The physical body may stop functioning in a moment, but the psyche, the inner soul of a person, can continue its process beyond that moment. According to her, some souls do not depart immediately, not because they are malevolent, afraid, or lost, but because their inner development has not yet reached completion. These are not ghosts in the folkloric sense. Rather, she described this phase as an archetypal stage of the transition, an in-between state in which the soul still resonates within the psychic field of the living, completing the last stages of detachment and resolution. Von Franz's view wasn't based on religious dogma or superstition. She grounded her conclusions in the analysis of thousands of dreams recorded over decades from patients who had recently lost loved ones. Again and again, she noted that the deceased would appear in dreams not as pale shadows or random memories, but as powerful, active figures, often speaking, helping, or guiding. These figures were sometimes clothed in strange robes, appearing on boats, walking through doors, or handing objects to the dreamer. Imagery full of symbolic weight. And here, von Franz drew a crucial connection to Jung's idea of the psychopomp. In Jungian psychology, the psychopomp is an archetype that functions as a guide between the conscious and the unconscious, and, especially in myths and dreams, between life and death. This figure appears in nearly every culture: the Egyptian Anubis, the Greek Hermes, the Roman Mercury, or even the angels in Christian tradition. In dreams following the death of a loved one, von Franz found that these archetypal guides often showed up to assist not only the living in their mourning, but also the soul of the departed in completing its journey. The presence of the deceased in such dreams, often accompanied by this guiding figure, suggested to her that the soul had not yet crossed fully into another realm, but was still engaged in a psychological transition. This idea of the soul lingering not as a spirit trapped between worlds, but as a part of a deeper archetypal process, offered a new way of understanding grief, memory, and the inexplicable feeling that someone is still with us. Von Franz was careful to clarify that this is not a denial of death. Rather, it is an acknowledgement of the full depth of the human psyche, which does not always conform to the neat timeline of biology. Just as we do not emotionally process death in a single moment, so too, she believed, the soul does not depart instantly. The unconscious continues to communicate, to process, and sometimes to appear. One of the most fascinating observations von Franz made was that people who are deeply connected to their own inner world, through reflection, dreams, or spiritual openness, are often the ones who report these experiences most clearly. It's not about believing in the paranormal. It's about being attuned to the symbolic language of the psyche. These people often describe vivid dreams in which the deceased conveys messages, offers comfort, or even appears to say goodbye at the exact time of their death, sometimes before the living even knows the person has passed. Von Franz saw these moments not as hallucinations, but as expressions of the deeper, archetypal fabric that connects all human consciousness. Her work challenges the modern Western view of death as a sharp, final line. Instead, it opens the door to the possibility that death is a passage through layers of symbolic and psychological meaning. And in those layers, the soul may pause. Not forever, not in haunting, but in a final gesture of presence. For von Franz, this wasn't mysticism. It was the quiet truth revealed in dreams, in symbols, and in the enduring dialogue between the living and the dead. Dreams in which the dead appear do not feel like ordinary night visions. Marie-Louise von Franz collected hundreds of accounts from analysts who had recently lost a parent, a sibling, or a close friend, and she noticed the same pattern again and again. These encounters carried a clarity that set them apart from everyday dream fragments. They opened with a sudden shift of atmosphere. A bright light in an otherwise dark scene. A door that seemed to lead nowhere. The soft sound of a voice long gone. The dreamer would often describe an almost physical warmth, as if the air itself were charged with affection. In that radiance, the deceased stepped forward, not as a ghostly specter, but as a solid, living presence. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they merely looked. Yet their message was unmistakable. Something unfinished needed to be healed. One young woman told von Franz that 6 months after her mother's death, she dreamed she was standing in an old railway station. In the dream, her mother walked toward her, smiling, and placed a small silver key into her hand. "You will know what to unlock," she said, then boarded a train and waved goodbye. The dreamer awoke in tears, overwhelmed by a sense of release. Days later, she discovered a locked wooden box in her mother's attic. The box contained a journal in which the mother had written letters of apology for past arguments. That discovery allowed the daughter to let go of lingering resentment. Von Franz saw in this story a textbook example of the archetypal psychopomp at work. The image of a station and a departing train symbolized the soul's transition, while the key represented the final act of reconciliation. Not every dream is so concrete. Some come years after the funeral, when grief has settled into silence, yet a subtle ache remains. A middle-aged widower told von Franz of a recurrent dream in which his late wife sat at their kitchen table, reading aloud from a recipe book. There was no conversation, only the sound of pages turning and the comforting smell of bread rising in the oven. On waking, he always felt a quiet peace and an unexpected urge to invite friends for dinner, an impulse that helped him break the isolation of mourning. Von Franz interpreted the dream as the psyche's way of using the familiar image of the wife to reopen the man's capacity for nourishment and community. The wife, she said, had become a restorative figure, guiding him back toward life. What struck von Franz most was the emotional signature of these dreams. They rarely induced fear. Instead, they brought a calm lucidity, a feeling that something larger than personal memory was at play. She argued that this calm arises because the dream is not produced by wishful thinking. It is activated by a deeper layer of the unconscious that Jung called the collective psyche. When a crucial bond ends abruptly, the inner world seeks completion. The figure of the deceased emerges as an autonomous symbol to finish the dialogue that waking life could not. Memory alone cannot stage such encounters with the same numinous power. That is why dreamers often remember every detail, including colors, scents, even the texture of the departed's clothing, years after the dream occurred. Von Franz also noted that these visits often arrive when the dreamer reaches a psychological milestone, an anniversary, the birth of a child, a new marriage, or a crisis that echoes unresolved issues with the deceased. The timing suggests a continuing psychic relationship, one that surfaces precisely when it can foster growth. After such dreams, many people report a transformed view of death. They no longer imagine the afterlife as a distant realm, but as a dimension that occasionally overlaps with the living psyche. The boundary between worlds feels thinner, and the fear of final separation softens. For von Franz, these nocturnal meetings are evidence that grief is not a straight line from loss to forgetfulness. It is a spiraling journey in which the dead can return, not to haunt, but to heal. By recognizing the symbolic truth of these dreams, by listening to what the soul is saying through the image of the beloved, we allow the inner process of mourning to reach completion. In that completion, the living discover that love persists, dialogue continues, and death, though real, is not the last word. In Jungian psychology, the idea of a soul lingering after death is not viewed as superstition, but as a symbolic expression of psychological and emotional reality. Marie-Louise von Franz explored this deeply in her work, emphasizing that the soul's journey does not always end abruptly at the moment of physical death. When there is unfinished business, feelings of guilt, unresolved conflict, or a sudden, traumatic parting, something in the psyche remains active. This doesn't mean the deceased literally walks the earth, but that their psychological imprint continues to resonate in the unconscious of those left behind. It is as if the emotional field between the living and the dead has not yet closed. Von Franz believed that in cases where the bond between two people was exceptionally strong, between parent and child, spouses, or lifelong friends, the soul of the deceased may become symbolically present in the psyche of the survivor. This presence is not fantasy. It is experienced as a subtle inner voice, an intuitive nudge, or a vivid sense that the person is still near. Many people report sensations of being watched over, feeling comforted at moments of distress, or suddenly knowing what the departed would say in a moment of doubt. These moments may seem small, but they are often emotionally charged and carry the unmistakable feeling of continued connection. In her writings, von Franz pointed out that this psychic presence often fades gradually, especially once the living have fully processed their grief or reached a new stage in life. But during the time it lingers, it plays an important psychological role. It helps the mourner integrate the loss, often by bringing buried emotions to the surface. Grief, yes, but also gratitude, anger, love, or regret. The symbolic figure of the deceased returns not to disturb, but to complete. In Jungian terms, the soul becomes an autonomous complex, activated in the unconscious in response to the emotional charge of the loss. It is not the dead themselves speaking in a literal sense, but the living psyche giving shape to what is unresolved. Interestingly, this phenomenon is not unique to the Western psychological model. Von Franz often referenced cross-cultural parallels, noting that many ancient and indigenous traditions share the belief that the soul does not depart immediately. In Tibetan Buddhism, for example, the Bardo period, the transitional state between death and rebirth, is said to last up to 49 days. During this time, the soul is thought to revisit places, people, and unresolved attachments before finally moving on. In certain African spiritual systems, ancestors remain in the realm of the living until their names are forgotten, continuing to influence family decisions and dreams. And in parts of rural India, it is customary to perform a series of rituals over several weeks to guide the soul gently out of the realm of the living. These traditions all echo the core idea that a sudden or incomplete departure leaves behind a ripple in the psychic fabric of those connected to the deceased. Modern researchers in near-death and shared-death experiences are beginning to note similar patterns. David Kessler and Raymond Moody have documented cases in which people, fully awake and healthy, report profound sensations of accompanying a loved one through their final moments, sometimes even seeing light, hearing voices, or feeling themselves pulled toward a different realm. What's striking is the emotional tone of these events, peaceful, loving, and deeply transformative. They mirror von Franz's notion of the soul remaining in the field of the living, not as a literal ghost, but as a meaningful psychological. Von Franz argued that these lingering presences should not be dismissed as hallucinations or grief-induced illusions. They are meaningful psychic events, rooted in archetypal patterns that guide the soul through transition. The soul, in her view, may pause between worlds to complete its symbolic journey. When mourners pay attention to the dreams, inner voices, and subtle signs that follow a death, they are not indulging in fantasy. They are participating in an ancient and universal process of psychic completion. In the Jungian approach, death is not a sharp rupture, it is a threshold, and sometimes those we love remain near that threshold until something deeper is healed. When the presence fades, it often leaves behind not emptiness, but clarity. A a sense that something important has been resolved. And that in turn helps the living take their next step, not away from the dead, but with their memory transformed into wisdom. In the view of Marie-Louise von Franz, the death of a loved one is not always the end of the relationship. It is often the beginning of its transformation. She believed that the psyche does not let go of deep emotional bonds simply because the physical body is gone. Instead, that bond shifts into an inner dialogue, a symbolic presence, and a process of psychological completion. But for this transformation to occur, the mourner must engage consciously with the images, dreams, and emotions that follow the loss. If these inner signals are ignored or repressed, the unfinished connection does not vanish. It lingers in the unconscious, often manifesting as anxiety, depression, or unexplainable feelings of restlessness. Von Franz emphasized that many people carry their losses for years, not because of the loss itself, but because the inner work of saying goodbye was never completed. The soul of the deceased, as it appears in dreams or inner impressions, does not return to haunt, but to help. These symbolic encounters may ask something of us: a final conversation, forgiveness, recognition, or even permission to go. By responding to these invitations, the mourner becomes an active participant in the process of transformation. The loss becomes not just something that happened, but something that has shaped them. It becomes integrated into the narrative of their own life. This process, according to Jungian psychology, is not mystical but archetypal. It reflects the ancient human need to ritualize transition, to honor endings, and to make meaning from suffering. The figures that appear in dreams after a death, the deceased parent, spouse, or friend, are often not random. They carry a message, and their emotional clarity sets them apart from ordinary dreams. Many describe these encounters as unforgettable, filled with warmth, peace, or a sense of final understanding. Often, after such a dream, people say they feel lighter, as if a burden has been lifted. This is not an illusion. It is the psyche's way of showing that the dialogue is complete. Von Franz believed that true mourning is not only about grieving, but about transforming. And this transformation often begins when we stop resisting the presence of the dead within us and start listening to what that presence is trying to say. Whether through a dream, a sudden memory, a symbol in everyday life, or an inexplicable emotion, the deceased may return to accompany us. Not because they are trapped, but because we are. And only when we recognize the gift of this final companionship can we fully release them, and ourselves, into a new stage of being. Across cultures, this wisdom echoes. From the Tibetan practice of guiding the soul through the bardo, to the African honoring of ancestors, to the quiet stories of those who feel watched over by their loved ones, there is a common thread. The dead may still be near until something within the living is healed. And when healing comes, it does not erase the bond. It changes it. The person becomes part of the fabric of our inner life, not as a wound, but as a source of insight and strength. In the end, von Franz offered a profound insight into grief, that the presence of the dead is not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be experienced. When we allow that experience to unfold, through memory, feeling, and dream, we move from mere survival to meaning. The pain of loss may never disappear, but it no longer owns us. It becomes part of the soul's journey. Perhaps this is the deepest form of love, when even death cannot destroy the inner bond between souls. Something remains, not in the air, not in ghostly form, but in the very heart of who we are. And that something stays just long enough to help us finish what was left unsaid, unseen, or unloved. Then, quietly, it lets go. Dear friends, thanks for watching. If you liked this video, please like it and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. See you soon.